I'm Don Tapscott.
And I'm Alex Tapscott.
And this is What's on Tap. Alex, over the last week, continuing saga of the infrastructure bill. For listeners, viewers, you remember that last week the Senate voted on a bipartisan amendment to amend the $1 trillion infrastructure bill that would have eliminated the bill's potentially disastrous ambiguities around digital assets, crypto, blockchain, innovation, and so on. But the amendment required unanimous consent, and every senator agreed to it except one, a retiring Republican from Alabama. So it passed without amendment. So the action shifts over to the House now. Mm-hmm. And there was an interesting development yesterday, I guess, which is that some advocates of blockchain in Congress have introduced the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. The two people are Tom Emmer, who's a Republican from Minnesota, and Representative Darren Soto, who's a Democrat from Florida. So is there hope? What's your view on this, Alex?
Well, it's hopeful to see lawmakers introducing something in a thoughtful and considered way, rather than as a last-minute addendum to a completely unrelated piece of legislation. So that is a sign of hope, that's for sure. I think when it comes to how we govern and how we regulate crypto assets, this is the right approach. There are sort of three ways to do this. One is through the administrative state, so regulatory agencies and other non-elected officials coming up with new rules of the road for how an industry ought to be regulated. The second way is to have it be jammed into some unrelated piece of legislation, like we saw last week, 2 weeks ago. And then the third way is the way I think most people would agree is the right way, which is for something to be introduced, for it to be open for comment, for there to be hearings and a level of transparency and voter feedback and industry feedback, so that the law captures the complexities and nuances of the industry and creates a set of standards and rules that everyone can agree is the right way to proceed. And I think that's what we've got here. Now, this blockchain bill it's related to but different from the infrastructure bill. What we did see in the context of the infrastructure bill was a number of Democratic lawmakers, and notably, Democratic lawmakers, which is notable because they're the ones who will have to vote together to basically get this thing passed through the House. We've seen those people say that the language should be amended, which is great. The safe harbor provision in this Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act goes one step further and tries to clarify how different kinds of tokens ought to be regulated to ensure that there's a safe harbor for innovation in the U.S. economy. So we'll see how this goes. This is being introduced into the House. It was introduced initially in 2019. So this is not a new piece of legislation, but it has been changed to reflect all the recent changes in the industry and the changing nature of the debate. But as you wrote quite eloquently in an op-ed that was published in Fortune magazine, the way things were done with the infrastructure bill was no way to create policy, and this is the right way. So obviously this is a hopeful and welcome addition to the discourse.
Right. And if you live in the United States, please phone, email, text, whatever your congressman, and say that we need a thoughtful process to figure this out. I mean, ultimately, we need a national blockchain digital asset strategy in the U.S. And for those of you who don't know, we've done a lot of work on this, and we developed a broad technology perspective for the Biden-Harris administration. And you can find it at blockchainresearchinstitute.org, blockchainresearchinstitute.org. The report's called New Directions for Government in the Second Era of the Digital Age, Strategy, Policy, and Action for the Biden-Harris administration. I'll tell you another thing that's really needed is an educational campaign for not just members of Congress, but for government elected representatives, and for that matter, for government employees, at the state level and even at the local level as well. I mean, Ted Cruz, not someone I agree with that often, said that if you asked for in all of Congress for the number of people uh, um, to who could stand up and say what is Bitcoin, that you'd probably get a handful of people who would be capable of doing that and who could speak for 2 sentences about this topic. So this is not good. This is the second era of the internet. It's part of the second era of the digital age. It's central to prosperity, to good government, to social development in the economy. And you can't have elected representatives that are not knowledgeable about this topic. You
Yeah.
can imagine the same thing was back in the days of the internet. Everyone had to get up to speed on the internet. They had to learn radical things like I, as a white male, can use a keyboard, for example, which was a hard step for most people in Congress. So I don't know. Any other thoughts on this one?
No, I think that, that the old joke from the 90s, not a joke, actually, someone in the government, in the Senate, called the internet a series of tubes. And I think that it's probably a more accurate description of the internet than what a lot of people think of the digital asset and blockchain industry today. So I do think there's definitely an educational campaign that's required.
Yeah. I remember Paul Krugman said that the internet will never be more important than the fax machine. There you go. All right, moving along. Facebook's stablecoin project, DM, previously known as Libra, has had a bunch of setbacks, including resistance from the government. Now it's facing another obstacle, Novi, which is Facebook's crypto-focused subsidiary, is formerly called Calibra, now wants to work with another stablecoin other than DM. What does all that mean? And a little more broadly, the action around stable coins as an alternative to central bank digital currencies is sort of emerging as being interesting. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. When Libra was first announced, Facebook had pretty big ambitions for what this thing could be. It was a stablecoin that was going to be pegged to a basket of many different currencies and, in effect, create an alternative monetary regime to the US dollar-based system we have today. Unsurprisingly, that was met with a lot of resistance in the government. And so they scaled back their ambitions to make it a US dollar stablecoin. But what's happened since the original Libra project was announced is that the stablecoin industry writ large has absolutely exploded in size. From, I think it was probably, I want to say maybe $2 or $3 billion of sort of circulating supply when Libra was first announced back in 2019. It's now like $130 billion. So, if I'm Facebook, it's like build versus buy versus adopt. Is it really worth it for them to build their own stable coin and incur all of the regulatory heat and pressure that they frankly don't want to attract for many reasons, including they're already under scrutiny from governments all around the world? Or do you want to adopt something that's already basically proven itself out as something that could work at a sort of Facebook scale, right? Stablecoins in 2019 were not really feasible in terms of their size and distribution, and also who was creating them to be used by 3 billion people, and maybe they're still not there, but they're certainly getting there today. So I don't know if it's doomed. I don't want to overreact to this headline that we saw, but it is worth sort of keeping this information in context. At the time that Facebook's Libra was announced, I wrote a lot of pieces about it and said, whether it's Facebook or somebody else, that the wheels of change were in motion, and it was hard to reverse it. And I think that that's certainly true. Facebook, by creating Libra, or at least by announcing Libra, I think helped to instigate a lot of corporate soul searching about what role crypto assets and stablecoins specifically were going to play in their business. And since then, we've seen a number of different companies hiring for very senior crypto roles. Amazon, we saw Walmart, and I think that stablecoins are going to be central to that. So I think the analogy I used at the time was, the first person through the wall gets a little bloody, and I think Facebook's taken a bit of a beating on this one. But I think that what they did in the long run is going to be good for this industry because it helped to expand people's perspective on what was possible for big companies in crypto. So it remains to be seen. Boy, I think it would be really interesting if Facebook were to adopt something like USDC, which is a stablecoin issued by a US-based company called Circle, and what impact that would have on the broader digital asset market. I mean, if you created something like this where people had to have a crypto asset wallet to hold a stablecoin, you'd be basically increasing the user base of crypto by 10 or 20x overnight. And I think that's certainly something that would be quite compelling and quite interesting for the whole industry.
Yeah. Some people know me as a taxonomy freak, guilty as charged. But just to be clear here, there are these three categories of digital currencies, of which that's a subset of the broader topic of digital assets, where basically every financial asset and all kinds of others are being represented by tokens or become tokens. Mm-hmm. And we have the community-based currencies like Bitcoin. Then there are the corporate currencies like DM. And we have the central bank digital currencies, like Chris Giancarlo is working towards creating the digital dollar. And this is the big bang in the universe, and it's not really clear how all of this is going to get played out. But there's a role for each of these. And I'll just mention one thing. Chris Giancarlo has a book coming out September 21st. It's called Crypto Dad. And you can now pre-order that book on Amazon.com. And it's a good book. I did a cover quote for it. The Winklevosses wrote the forward to it. And it's a thoughtful intervention into this conversation, which will continue for some time. I tell you, stable coins are emerging as a pretty interesting alternative, though, to a central bank digital currency, because maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. Mm-hmm. A lot of benefits of a CBDC without the main liabilities, which is Big Brother. It was a kind of a key one that this would give a nefarious state all kinds of advantages to further spy in the most detailed and molecular way on the transactions of its citizens.
Absolutely. And we know for a fact that that's what central bankers are seeing as one of the main benefits of a central bank digital currency. And maybe not across the whole world. Giancarlo would say that privacy is an essential right, and financial privacy is foundational to the American system. But in China, we know that the government's taken a different approach. In Europe, the head of the Bank of International Settlements has stated explicitly that basically money is not a freedom, and people don't have financial rights, and that they should be surveilled by governments, and that's a really great thing. So I think that the battle lines of this fight are definitely being drawn today, and I think that the U.S. system is probably one that I think could be a model where the Federal Reserve will regulate and oversee stable coins along with other financial regulatory agencies, but may not create it themselves. And in fact, we know from a recent speech that one of the members of the Federal Reserve Board delivered, saying as much, right? Saying that, private companies have a long history of supporting and furthering the US dollar system. And there's no reason why they couldn't do the same thing with stablecoins. And some critics, I think misguided critics, say, well, aren't US dollar stablecoins going to somehow erode the power of the Federal Reserve and the US dollar? And it's like, of course not. they're the sharp end of the stick. They are the ones who are innovating and making sure that the dollar remains as relevant now as it ever has been. So I don't take that criticism, very seriously either. Speaking of big companies, by the way, introducing new ideas around blockchain, I mentioned Walmart and Amazon. I think that their focus is sort of more narrow at this point. It's around making it easier for people to buy goods on their platforms. But one company led by one of Bitcoin's greatest advocates, Jack Dorsey, called Twitter, you may have heard of it, has just hired someone to oversee this initiative called Blue Sky, which is basically a decentralized social media working group. We talked about this a little bit in Blockchain Revolution, the idea of how the Internet of Information has created new powerful intermediaries. One of those intermediaries are big social media companies who capture all this information about you, but maybe don't share in the upside, and that information could end up in the wrong hands and so forth. And now we're seeing one of the CEOs of one of the largest social networks in terms of clout, maybe not in terms of users and value. Twitter is more of a niche product compared to, say, Facebook, saying that he wants to basically decentralize Twitter. So I thought that was sort of an interesting headline. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, of course, the big issue here is Facebook has a clear business model. It owns the asset class of the digital age, data, as does Facebook. And as you pointed out, for us end users, creates a lot of problems. You can't use that data to plan your life. You can't monetize it. And there's a new class of a new species of business that we call digital conglomerates that represent the top 5, half of NASDAQ, and 20% of the S&P 500. And we create the data, but they're becoming wealthy. It means that the data is not secure because it's on central servers. It means that our privacy is being undermined, and privacy is the foundation of freedom. And this data can't be aggregated in an anonymized way for social purposes, like, say, in a pandemic, where our health data, we should be able to make sense of that from a public health view. So, yes, we desperately need decentralized social media where we get to own our data. And this is one of the holy grails, if there can be more than one, of this next era of the digital age, is citizens recovering their data. And an initiative like this is super interesting. I'm fascinated that they would want to do this, and there's got to be a business model for it. I mean, the easiest thing is you charge to use, or you pay to use a social platform. I know I would happily do that if I got to keep my data. Many people would not. Many people do this Faustian deal with these big networks that, sure, you provide me with a platform, but you get to keep my data. But ultimately, I don't think that that's really a sustainable model. And we pose the issue, as you remember in Blockchain Revolution, will these big digital conglomerates understand that this business model ultimately is not something that's either viable or in the interests of society, and try and embrace a new one? So the fact that one of these big platforms, Twitter, is exploring the idea, they've hired Jay Glaber. She used to be a Zcash developer and brings a lot of crypto expertise and privacy into this whole movement. Is very interesting. Maybe Twitter might eventually migrate to the Twitter app, or migrate Twitter to a new sort of decentralized protocol. So yeah.
Well, no, I was going to say that is the holy grail. I think we're a long way from that, and I think that Jack Dorsey at Twitter is very focused on Bitcoin at the moment, and the idea of figuring out a way to bootstrap the Bitcoin protocol to make this work. I'm not sure if that'll be successful. Maybe it will be. Who knows? But I think that the effort is really genuine, and he's taking it really seriously. The flip side to this is that as the forum for all of the most important information in the world, which is what Twitter is, and where all the most influential people go to share their opinions, including politicians and presidents and ex-presidents. Twitter could be looking for a way to basically pass the buck on monitoring and censoring and governing who gets to use the protocol and how. If it's an open, or who gets to use the company's services. If it's a protocol, then it's up to the owners of the protocol, probably token holders, who each earn a share of the Twitter ecosystem by how they contribute to it or something like that, to dictate who gets to stay and who gets to go. I don't know. It's sort of fascinating. I think that figuring out a way to tokenize Twitter would be a great way to monetize Twitter. Right now, Twitter is the ratio of influence to revenue is the highest of any entity in the history of humanity. Twitter's market cap is like a 40th what Facebook's is. But the world would function without Facebook. I don't think the world could function without Twitter, at least the way it does today. So anyway, so we'll see. So we'll see about that. Maybe I'm like a real Twitter fan, but
but it raises a very important issue, which is about the governance of these decentralized platforms and how does that work? And not just how do you raise money, but when funds are raised, how do they get allocated? I can't say much about this. I'm allowed to say it exists, but IOHK, which owns Cardano and some other stuff, has launched a big project in collaboration with the Boston Consulting Group. We're involved in it deeply to sort of scope out some new models of governance and managing funds for protocol development and for the development of these platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And stay tuned for that one because it's going to be mighty interesting when it's introduced. We will be reaching out to the public for comment about it. And I'll mention, do you have anything else for this week, Alex?
No, that's quite a lot to cover for 1 week.
Yeah, I'll mention that the Enterprise Blockchain Awards, the deadline is Friday. So please get in your awards, your award nominations. There are multiple different categories. And to do that, you can go to blockchainrevolutionglobal.com, blockchainrevolutionglobal.com, and click on the tab that says awards. And we'll be holding a big ceremony November 17th. And hopefully it'll be a physical event, black tie, fancy, lots of fun. It'll be in Toronto and broadcast globally. So what's on tap for this week? We'll see you all soon and keep them letters and cards coming. Take care.
Bye, everyone.